Hi everyone, welcome back to the Dadsplaining Politics.
Hi everyone. Hi Dada. Welcome back to our podcast. We're a little bit later than normal because we've had a lot going on at the moment.
Happy 21st birthday.
Thank you so much. I had a big 21st party, which I'm sure a couple of you would have been at if you're regular listeners of the podcast. So that was fun. But we've got a lot to catch up on.
We do, lots to catch up on. We're going to cover a few things today. First of all, what I call the Telegram debacle in the US with Trump's national security team. The plunging stock market around the world, including Australia. Today I was just reading that $38 billion has been wiped off the Australian stock market today, that is Monday. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what's been called Liberation Day, the imposition of tariffs around the world on April 2nd. And then we'll move to the terrible situation in Myanmar with the earthquake, thousands of people injured and killed. And we will finish off with the Australian election, which has now been called for May 3rd.
Finally, obviously, that was taking a while to happen, but he didn't really have much time left, considering there's a limit on how long you can wait to hold the election.
That's true,
right?
But we had the cyclone, so he couldn't really call the election during that, and it was very wise of him to wait.
Yeah, definitely. So let's get into something else. A little bit further away from home, we'll go back to the US, as we generally do, and talk about what's been happening with foreign security there and how they are getting their information around.
So for those of you who may not know, Telegram is a messaging app, a bit like WhatsApp, a little more secure than WhatsApp, but it's a public messaging app.
Not that much more secure, though. It's still in the realm of a public messaging app, still controlled by, a private company.
That's true, and not secure for military purposes. Yeah. So the US was planning a strike on the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And so the National Security Advisor, the Vice President, multiple members of the Trump cabinet were talking about on Telegram when they were going to strike Yemen, how terrible the Europeans are, that they should be doing this, and the Europeans aren't paying, and it pisses them off that they're doing this.
But more specifically, just a comprehensive list of every actionable that they were planning on doing in Yemen.
Yes.
A comprehensive list and rundown on exactly what they were planning on enacting. So
Correct.
That's absolutely insane. Like a lot of I've been reading about what American governments typically do in times of foreign intervention and intelligence, etc., etc. And they have rooms for this
Your situation room.
They have the situation room where typically information like this wouldn't even leave the room, let alone be any form of messaging or even a secure government messaging platform. But how have we come to the point where we're hardly in the situation room anymore? We're just going on a public messaging website. It's as bad as texting on WhatsApp.
And the irony is you remember years back when the Republicans and Trump told Hillary Clinton off for using a personal email to send something. The irony of this situation, how that was a national security threat, and versus this is terribly dangerous. And interestingly, they added the editor of what's called The Atlantic, a very good publication if anyone want to check out up-to-date publications. They added him to the chat group on Telegram.
Well, I mean, naturally, that's how everyone found out about it.
Yeah, by mistake. And fortunately, when he published it, he redacted the names of some special services personnel so that they would not be the target of being killed. I mean, this is so terrible. And the denials by the Trump White House saying, it's not such a big deal, and this is a liberal plot to make a big deal out of this, etc., is, unbelievable.
But it's also incredibly terrifying, really, when you think about, thank God it fell into the hands of an Atlantic journalist, someone who probably has some morals,
yes,
obviously wants to get the truth out there and maybe isn't on the Trump administration's side. But they're not like an enemy individual. They're not someone who's trying to go up against the American government. This information could have targeted those servicemen and could have used those plans not sending them to the public, waited for them to be enacted, waiting for the servicemen to be like attacking the Houthis, and then turned it against them.
Totally.
Like there are endless potential for disaster in this one situation. You just wouldn't have to think that you would tell the American government to not be like texting their mates.
Well, I think this has
on a group chat.
I think this has a number of major implications. If I'm a member of the Five Eyes establishment, UK and Australia, you're going to start to think, can I really trust the Americans in treating this sort of stuff seriously? China and Russia absolutely will have infiltrated US Secret Service channels now with this. They're going to really need to think about this and how do they recover from this and how do they go back to a far more secure platform, which is the military standard. Right?
It's interesting you mentioned that as well, because I've been thinking about that a lot recently. And the fact that there's a point where how can you respect an alliance that you have with a partner who doesn't respect any of the top officials that you have in your own security establishment? So that's already a big issue, that they're not going to be able to work together. And there's also, just plainly the issue that the US holds a lot of its information private. But, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, they share most of their intelligence directly with the US and they don't keep much of it private for their own countries. So the US is able to keep all its information private and is not held to the same standard. So obviously we can't go on sending this streamlined, curated information back to the US when all they're going to do is send it out to journalists and put it on the world news.
It just smacks of incompetence and people not really caring and just being drunk with power, which we know that is that scenario. So pretty astounding stuff.
Even just like a lack of experience.
Yes.
A lack of experience, a lack of understanding, a lack of respect for their job and what it means for the world. A lack of understanding even about America's place in the world and what these small things can do to impact the entire international security framework,
Agreed. So an aligned thing with the tariffs on and off again, the stock market declining dramatically in the US and around the world, more so in the US than elsewhere. But Australia, as I mentioned in the intro, the Australian stock market has dropped $38 billion today, just as we speak. And this is even before what's been called Liberation Day on April 2nd. No, it's not an April Fool's joke.
Before it has been announced.
Before it's been announced.
Yes.
And Liberation Day is what the Trump establishment is calling the liberation of the US from all these tariffs and GST and taxes other countries put on their goods.
And even, interestingly enough, the use of subsidies in other countries has been criticized by the Trump administration.
Like the pharmaceutical benefit scheme.
Pharmaceutical benefit scheme, exactly. So that's another step further, but we haven't seen a lot of countries take a stand against.
Well, I think there's so much confusion about what the US wants to do with this and what they are going to do and what they're not going to do. And if you think about the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, that's a core element of any socialist country like Australia, the national health systems, etc. And of course, Big Pharma doesn't like that because the US system is not like that. They should be like that. And so, Australia's been taking a softly approach with the US at the moment. But, if we do get tariffs on our beef and attacking of our pharmaceutical benefit scheme, the government's going to need to act. It's a very difficult situation, though, for Albanese, right, in the midst of an election campaign, and he's got to be careful.
Well, no, of course. But let's go back to a little bit why the stock markets are dropping so dramatically. Specifically why. And that is because, of course, the uncertainty that everyone is feeling. They don't know whether Trump is making all these moves to cause shock or to have bargaining power, or if he's actually doing it because he believes that it will improve America's independence and increase jobs, etc., etc. So obviously that has made investors quite flummoxed. I know you yourself, as someone who likes to dabble in the stock market, has been flip-flopping back and forth, unsure of what to do.
Yep.
Whether to withdraw now before it gets even worse, after it's already taken a massive dive, or whether to, hold in for the long run and see what happens. But it's really such an unpredictable situation. I think it could be safer to pull out all of it right now if I would be advising any investors, but don't listen to me.
And we're not providing investment advice on this podcast.
No, we're not.
And, you know, it's the world is a crazy enough place as it is without doing your own goals. This, in a way, what Trump is doing to America reminds me a little bit of Brexit, which was prior to the Trump administration, the greatest act of national self-harm in history. And the same thing is happening now from an economic point of view, because people are scared, people are uncertain. And wherever there's uncertainty, it's not good for the stock market, because people want to invest with certainty. And at the moment, they don't know what's going to be happening.
Exactly. We don't know. And then with this, the onset of this Liberation Day, which is essentially, to go into more detail, a day in which Donald Trump will unveil the future of American tariffs on other countries' goods. So it's not going to be the day that tariffs come into play. It's going to be the day in which he simply unveils the tariffs. But of course, that has to be given a name and celebrated as some type of holiday. The level of, like, what would you call it? Ostentatious hubris that requires to orchestrate something like that is just unbelievable. But yeah, so that's going to be happening. It's going to be on all countries, we've been told. And even Russia has started to maybe be a little scared because Trump has taken a turn on his support for Russia. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yes, that's just hot off the press, right?
In the news, yeah. So what's happened is, obviously, Trump appeared very naive in his optimism about a ceasefire being called between Ukraine and Russia. And everyone told him, look, that's not going to happen. Putin is not a guy you can just negotiate with. But Trump said, no, I'm going to make it work. We're friends. We're buddies. It has not happened. We are, like a month or more on from when Trump started making these claims. Nothing has happened. Trump has started to get a little pissy. They had over an hour-long phone call of Trump being mad at Putin for not following through on his promises. And now Trump has said that he will put tariffs, obviously. There are the tariffs on oil coming out of Russia, but also secondary tariffs on oil, which is where the US would put tariffs on countries that buy oil from Russia, in addition to the tariffs that they already have on Russian goods. So that's quite a step in the other direction from going to supporting Putin.
Well, I'm pleased that he's hopefully he'll hold Putin to account somewhat.
I think everyone took a sigh of relief, but you know how he goes back and forth from all of his opinions, so we have no idea what's going to happen.
Well, hopefully there will be some huge investment in Ukraine in military and huge sanctions on Putin, and one can only hope. It'll be very interesting. And I read a report, interestingly, with all this discussion of Liberation Day, the US doesn't have a GST like we have in Australia. So in a way, it may be actually a smart economic move for the US to do that. That would be a way for them to raise a great deal of revenue. It would be inflationary, but at the same time, they'd have to decrease income tax in order to do that.
But GST is a progressive tax, yes? Isn't it? I think it is. I don't think they like progressive taxes in the US. I think the labeling that the Republican Party would give that, if anyone tried to push it through, it would just get denied almost immediately. Well, the term progressive isn't going to be...
No, but a GST does impact lower income people more than higher income because they buy more.
Oh no, so is it the opposite?
It's the opposite, it's regressive.
Well, that's why I was confirming with you, because I'm not exactly an economics student, so I thought that maybe the economics student would know, but never mind. That's right.
It just took a little while to get to the
That's right. For all our listeners, we are politics people, not economics people, so we're trying our best, but let's get on to the next topic, maybe.
And so we're going to move to Myanmar because there's been a terrible earthquake and thousands of people injured and killed. And of course, there was a civil war going on in Myanmar.
Still is.
And so that doesn't help the situation where it's chaotic to begin with. And now there are people under rubble and the recovery operation is not that organized.
No, definitely not. I mean, obviously, how can it be organized when there is a civil war going on? And I know that Statistics-wise, I think that it was a 7.7 magnitude earthquake. It struck near the old royal capital of Mandalay, so in a very, high density area. And at least 1,700 people have died, and I think around mid-3,000s people have been known to be injured, but every day they're finding more people dead than alive. And the conditions are definitely not positive, because I know that today it's meant to get up to 40 degrees. And so rescue workers have been finding people already decaying, and like the smell of like human flesh.
And it was pretty dramatic because, of course, it impacted Thailand and Bangkok and other nearby places. And
I mean, it virtually looked like it impacted the entirety of the country.
And you may have seen some dramatic footage of these high-rise hotels with pools on the side and the water washing out of these pools down the buildings and stuff. Pretty dramatic stuff.
Yeah, pretty terrifying, really. And it's an interesting reminder, that despite climate change, despite, the world economy, et cetera, disasters can still happen that really are out of our control.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And, it's really like, it feels like the world telling us, I'm in charge here, like I'm the boss. Like, don't start getting high and mighty. Yeah, stop messing with nature. Like, you got to understand that fact.
So we'll bring you more on Myanmar next week as we get more.
Oh, but one more thing I will say, just before we move on from that, is that I just know, because of the Civil War, there have been some really horrific, like, human rights things going on, because a lot of the groups, the military groups, have still been putting strikes on various areas of the country and pursuing further military exercises while this is going on. And you'd think that any military group would wait
that's crazy,
for there to be recuperation, but that level of like lack of empathy is really quite horrifying.
Lack of humanness,
yeah.
So let's move to the Australian elections, now slated for May 3rd. Interestingly, in the latest polls, there's been a bit of a swing back towards Albanese and the Labor Party. Peter Dutton had a few own goals recently, where he wasn't in Brisbane during the cyclone. He was at a fundraiser where he called Albanese weak and limp-wristed, which is not appropriate, where he talked about people should be back to the office, with sort of no understanding of what hybrid work or working from home is, and trying to make that some sort of...
I think we talked about this a bit in the last episode, though.
It was very surprising. So anyway, all those things came together, is that it seems like Albanese and Labor at this point are on a little bit of a roll, but the polls are saying exactly sort of dead heat scenario.
Look, we know that their odds have been increasing ever since the beginning of the year. So the Labor camp really knew what they were doing in waiting to call the election for the last second. And the Trump bump, which is what it's been known as, is the effect that Trump's tariffs and erratic actions have been having on other countries across the world. So obviously we talked about this last episode, how it impacted Canada, and now we've seen that this exact phenomenon has impacted Australia. The fear that we could elect someone similar to Trump, and the more similarities that Albo and other members of Parliament and media sources draw between Dutton and Trump makes Dutton's chances worse. So that's been really interesting to see. And I know as well there's also some interesting numbers on the amount of young voters who have now aged into voting this election, and voters, my demographic, I suppose, my age group, are much more wary of Trump than anyone in your age group and above. So
particularly young women, less so young men.
No, but let me just say that young voters overall, because I don't want to keep putting distance between those two camps, right?
But there is some distance.
We know that there's some distance, but we like to think that there's not. And if there's a statistic that's telling us that younger people on average are against Trump, we want to keep that statistic. We don't want to drive more of a wedge between two groups. It's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. We want to bring people together again.
You're right. Overall, that's the case.
Yes. So that's what has been happening here at the moment, and obviously the independents are still doing very well. The big parties aren't happy about that. Trumpets are patriots. How have they been doing? Have you noticed?
When we in this area have Bradfield, this seat just north of us, where we live in Sydney, and that's always been a Liberal seat. Paul Fletcher was the MP, and he's retiring. So that's possibly favoured to go to a Teal candidate. But then some of the other Teal seats, Tim Wilson, the Liberal member for Kooyong, I believe, is competing in that seat again. It's our view that the Teals will be able to maintain their seats, but, who knows? I mean, things can change in 5 weeks quickly in an election campaign, right? It's a matter of getting through that and keeping your messages clear and convincing people, because there's still the argument that people are much worse off than they were 3 or 4 years ago, right?
Yeah,
and so they blame the government for that.
I know, but I don't think the Teals are within that responsibility. I don't think people blame the Teals because they're not the government.
No, that's true. They don't blame the Teals. I'm thinking more about the backlash against Labor.
Yes, there can be backlash against Labor, but I think this is an extraordinary situation with Trump and everything he's doing, and the fear that everyone has that, cost of living is only going to get worse.
But Freddie, I think the stats are on the polling. People feel like Peter Dutton can do a better job of dealing with Trump than Albo can, because part of this.
But there are many other factors to take into place. Maybe Peter Dutton would get along better than Trump, but I know that people trust Albanese more. There's a high level of trust.
Okay, that's fair.
For him.
But they think Dutton's stronger than Albanese. They think Albanese.
But there's only so far that strength goes. What is strength? Like having the lack of will to bow down to Trump and do anything that he says, because that's exactly what I imagine Dutton doing. I don't know about you. I think that Albo is much more likely to stand up against him than Dutton is. I think Dutton would simply want to get in his good books.
I think you're being a little unfair. I mean, I think Dutton is, representing Australia, and he'd want the best for Australia. I think both of them would stand up to Trump. I don't think it's a big deal.
Dutton?
I think this is part of the messaging they've got, and the coalition messaging on Albo is that he's weak, and that has some resonance in the community. And the messaging on Dutton and the Liberals are that they don't really have solid policies.
Yes, maybe they're strong, but if they have nothing to back them up with, what will they even be strong on?
Mm-hmm. So anyway, look, it's going to be fascinating, and we are looking forward to the election campaign over the next 5 weeks. We'll look to have some guest speakers over the next few weeks, because we'd like to add that to the podcast going forward. So if any of you know of anyone who'd like to be interviewed, let us know.
We do have a few lined up.
We do have a few ideas.
A few weeks to get organised with that. And before we have our guest speaker next week, we're going to be talking about the situation in the Congo and everything happening there, because I am just putting out an op-ed at my internship. So maybe we can go through the topic of my op-ed and talk a bit about that and about some areas that we have neglected a bit in the podcast so far.
Great. Look forward to that, Freddie. All right. Until next time. Bye all.
Thanks so much for listening. Bye.